The story of Cinderella. Cinderella's dreams were coming true at last. With the help of her mouse friends, we had managed to race down the stairs just in time to try on the glass slippers on the Grand Duke had brought. It proved that she was the girl the prince had met and fallen in love with at the royal ball. Now, she and the prince were going to be married, and their brand new life together would soon begin. But first, there was a wedding to plan, and Cinderella didn't have the faintest idea of where to begin. Prudence, who ran Castle's household for the kings, was happy to take charge. She sat with Cinderella and read of a long list of things that needed to be done for the wedding. "Excuse me," Cinderella said with Prudence paused for a moment. "But couldn't the prince and I just have a simple wedding?" Prudence frowned. "Cinderella, now that you are going to be a princess, you need to start thinking like one. This should be the grandest wedding the kingdom has ever seen." Later on, the royal dressmaker arrived with several wedding gowns. The first gown Cinderella tried on was covered with bows and sashes and had a huge skirt. "The guests will mistake me for a present," she cried. "You look just like a princess," Prudence said. But Cinderella thought her dress was too fussy. "Do you think you could design something plainer?" she asked. "Plain and princess do not go together," Prudence said. The next day, Prudence and Cinderella visited the royal forest. He presented them with a bouquet of roses, which was so big it looked more like a bush. Inaw diha. "Plain and princess do not go together," Prudence said. The next day, Prudence and Cinderella visited the royal forest. He presented them with a bouquet of roses, which was so big it looked more like a bush. "Do you have something a bit smaller?" Cinderella asked. "It's perfect," Prudence said. "You just have to know how to carry it." She grabbed the flowers and a bee flew out. "Buzz, buzz, buzz," Prudence screamed, and the bees stung her. Then she screamed even louder. Pikita ang pictures as a cartoon. "Where's Bossy Lady?" asked Goose. "Poor Prudence," replied Cinderella. "She got a quite a nasty bee sting." Poor Prudence," replied Cinderella. "She got a quite a nasty bee sting. The royal physician says she has to stay in bed for the rest of the day." "But what about the wedding plans?" Jax asked. "I'll just have to take care of them myself," Cinderella declared. "Look at the size of this list. What do you think I should do first?" "Who's a common Cinderella?" wondered Jack. "The guest list? Good idea, Jack. Let's see. Well, of course, all of you are invited," Cinderella replied. "And my fairy godmother too. I wish she were here right now." Almost as fast as Cinderella made her wish, the fairy godmother appeared. "I just love weddings," the fairy godmother said, "and I'm sure everything you've picked out is wonderful." Cinderella admitted she hadn't started planning. "When is the wedding, dear?" asked the fairy godmother. Gus counted on his fingers. "Tomorrow," he announced. "Oh my goodness, child!" cried the fairy godmother. "We'd better get started." "Let's to do," Jack added. He and Goose showed Prudence list to the fairy godmother. "Well, plan an absolutely magical wedding for you, dear," the fairy godmother gushed. "Now, let's begin with the dress," She waved her wand, and Cinderella was instantly adorned in the elegant white gown. But the fairy grandmother had forgotten something. It's beautiful, Cinderella said, but don't you think it needs a veil? The fairy grandmother wasn't listening, though she had already moved into the next item. Invitations! She declared. In the blink of an eye, thousands of lovely cards sat and stacked around the room. Now we shall prepare the feast and make the cake, the fairy grandmother announced. Cinderella changed back into her blue dress and followed the fairy grandmother to the royal kitchen. Meanwhile, three of the mice lifted some scissors and cut a small piece of fabric from the underneath Cinderella's wedding gown. Then they threaded needles, pulled out a box of tiny pearls, and began to make a veil. The rest of the mice each took a stack of cards. The rest of the mice each took a stack of cards to deliver. They didn't give very far before their plans were spoiled by the pom-pom, the castle cat. Whew! Close a call! Jack cried, and he and Goose raced to the kitchen, where Cinderella was with the fairy grandmother. And now, for the best part, fairy grandmother exclaimed, with one grand sweep of her wand. She created the biggest fancy cake Cinderella had ever seen. What do you think? The fairy grandmother asked. Prudence will love it, Cinderella said, trying to hide her disappointment. And speaking of Prudence, I really should go to see how she's feeling. Poor child, the fairy godmother said after Cinderella had left. I think all these wedding plans are too much for her. Jack and Goose tugged at the fairy godmother's lip. Cinderella likes smaller things, Jack told her. Goose pointed proudly to himself. Just like me! At all once, the fairy grandmother understood why Cinderella hadn't been thrilled. The fairy grandmother went to Cinderella's room a little later. I'm afraid I must have gotten a bit carried away, my dear, she confused. Now tell me, what will the wedding of your dreams be like? After listening to Cinderella, the fairy grandmother began to perform her magic. With a wave of her wand, the veil was finished. Then the invitation were sent to a smaller group of people. Now let's cut the cake down to size, fairy grandmother said with a twinkle in her eyes. Cut the cake down to size, the fairy grandmother said with a twinkle in her eye. As they walked into the kitchen, Cinderella turned to the mice. Thank you, my little friends, she said gratefully. Anything for you, Cinderella, Jack said. Biddy biddy body boo, the fairy grandmother cried as she pointed at the cake. Biddy biddy body boo, the fairy it shrunk and shrunk until it was the size of a normal wedding cake. The fairy grandmother followed the breeze gaze. God heaven child, she exclaimed. You can't get married in your bare feet. She waved her wand and suddenly Cinderella was wearing glass slippers. Followed the breeze gaze. God heaven child, she exclaimed. You cannot get married in your bare feet. She waved her wand and suddenly Cinderella was wearing glass slippers. After the ceremony, there was a joyful party. It wasn't the kingdom's grandest celebration, but it was the most special. Even Prudence was pleased. How you manage all of this? The prince asked Cinderella, smiled and said, with friends by your side, anything is impossible. The end.